What's up, everyone? So today I figured because it's interview season and I've been meeting a lot of interviewees, I would just do a short video on just general interview tips, 5 specific ones that I found really helpful for me and that I've learned interviewers also appreciate. So that's what we'll be talking about today. 5 tips for your medical school interview. For context, this will be traditional interview tips. They are not interview tips for the MMI. I have a separate video on that right up here, but these are tips just for traditional interviews and more importantly, just on how to have an effective conversation, which will be happening in pretty much any interview you go to. So let's do it. All right, so let's just get straight into it. 5 interview tips for all of you. First one is going to be know your application. This is very simple. You should know your application inside and out. And that implies not just the application for your AMCAS, but also the secondary that you submitted to the school. Because sometimes they'll read your secondary and have follow-up questions about your secondary that they'll want to ask you. And one really easy way to get rejected is to say, excuse me, I don't know what you're talking about. And that is boom, right there, you're done. Because that implies that you don't actually know what you wrote down. And even if you give phenomenal answers from there on out, if you didn't know the fundamental of what you submitted to the school, it's almost as bad as kind of misspelling the school's name, because that implies that you didn't even read over your application. So know your application. Know the pertinent negatives, positives, and also know things that you want to add. So for example, for me on my application, I had listed that I had extracurricular activities that were not listed in the application. And one of the things I would always bring up is, oh, by the way, I'm also working on this. Oh, by the way, you know that Kaplan job I was doing? Yeah, I also added on a couple more teaching jobs, including the MCAT, SAT, and ACT. So I'm not just doing what I had mentioned on the application, but I'm also doing a bit more than that. So by doing that, you'll not only show that you know your application, you also show that you have the right things to add. Because that way the interviewer says, okay, so they've read their application and they can now update me on anything that there is to be updated on. Tip number 2, have down the fundamentals. So especially in a traditional interview, you will inevitably be asked these questions in one way or another. You will be asked about telling them about yourself. You will be asked why medicine. You will be asked about tell me about one way you resolve the conflict. And more often than not, you will also be asked some healthcare related questions, such as, what do you think the biggest problem in healthcare is today? Where do you see healthcare in 10 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? So one of the things you should know is how you're going to address these questions. You should not have rehearsed answers. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you should have a schema to answer these questions. So that way, when it comes up, you say, okay, I know exactly why medicine, A, B, C, D, but you can bring it all together with maybe even a touch of, oh, this is why I want to be a doctor, and this is how this medical school specifically will help me accomplish that goal. Similarly, tell me about conflict resolution. Don't have a rehearsed answer, I know person A and person B and boom, I solved their conflict, but do have ideas about, okay, so here's one of the leadership activities I did, and this activity we had an instance where we had to solve this, and this is how I went about doing it. By having these schemas in your head, you will set yourself up for success because these are kind of like gimme questions. You should be expecting these questions. And for interviews, I would actually, after each interview, write down every question I got asked and write down a brief answer I had to it and then try to refine it. So that way, when I got asked the question again, I'd say, what can I improve here? What can I change? Number 3 is the interviewer. Almost inevitably, you will be given the name of your interviewer. You should look him or her up as soon as possible. And the reason I say this is because it's always good to have a background on where the interviewer is coming from. Because, for example, I had a very heavy basic science background. But more often than not, the interviewers I had in med school didn't give 2 craps about basic science because they were physicians and usually did clinical research. So for me to go in depth about saying, oh, I designed this short guide RNA and I had it edit this mitochondrial genome and eventually we created this new vector, that's nothing to them. That goes straight over their head. So by knowing their background, of course you can ask them their background, but that also comes across as, are you interviewing them or are they interviewing you? So by just knowing their background, you can kind of adjust things and you can say, I can tell you briefly about my research, but if you have more questions, just let me know. And then kind of give a brief overview based on the fact that, oh, they're more clinical, my research was basic science, or vice versa. They're more basic science, my research was more clinical. Let me show them how my clinical research applies to basic science. And perhaps some of the bigger questions it brings up that basic science can help investigate. Similarly, I always like to think about an interview as a good practice for patients. You don't control your interviewer. You don't control their perceptions. You don't control the type of person they are. Your goal is to just connect with them. And that's kind of what you're going to be doing in medical school with patients. You don't control your patients. You don't control the beliefs they have. You don't control the situation they're being put in. You don't control the way they react to you. You just control the fact that this is a person and you need to make a connection with them. And so one of the biggest things that can help is to see where that person is coming from. And for interviewers, you can often get that by looking them up. But even for patients, you can get that by just engaging with them, like, oh, tell me about what you do. And by finding a point of mutual attraction, you will actually be able to really open up the conversation and become more comfortable with the interviewer and allow yourself to feel more comfortable. For example, my Yale interview, one of my interviewers was a swimmer. He swims. And I connected with him on that because I was like, I love exercise. Running means the world to me. And the fact that you're a swimmer, even though these are entirely different sports, tells me that we share similar mentalities. We clearly care a lot about staying active. We clearly care a lot about endurance. We clearly care a lot about aerobic exercise. You may like swimming because it brings out the same feelings I get when I'm running, which is the endorphin high, the fact that you can believe and make yourself feel like you can accomplish anything when you go on a run or go on a swim. So really knowing these things about your interviewers can help open the discussion up a bit more and make both of you feel a bit more comfortable and say, hey, we're both humans here. We both have a shared interest. And very rarely will you find a human that you don't have anything with, because at the end of the day, you're human. So try to find at least a point where you can maybe be like, okay, we might not be the same person, but here's where we can try to connect. And that's something that you can get by potentially looking up the interviewer. Number 4, quotes can be great. I love quotes, especially inspirational quotes. There's always a couple quotes that I keep very close to my heart because they mean a lot to me. Steve Jobs always said, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking back. And I've always loved that quote because it kind of resonates with me because as going into medicine, it's so hard to say, I know exactly what it is I want to do. But you can kind of know, like, this is what I want to do, and I'm hoping I'll figure it out. But as I said, I can't connect the dots looking forward. But looking back, I'm sure that the journey I'm going on is going to be the perfect journey for me. And that's something that resonated with me. And so I always use that quote in interviews sometimes to kind of show everyone what I'm feeling about medicine. Another quote I always use is fall down 7 times, stand up 8. And that's a quote that often Nike uses. And that quote means a lot to me because resilience is such a big part of my personality. So by having 1 or 2 quotes that really resonate with you, I think you can actually open up the conversation and integrate those quotes into your talking. For example, you will be asked about resilience. You will be asked about times when you failed. And by having quotes that really rectify what you're feeling with what you actually did, you kind of show the person like, oh, I get it. And especially with big, meaningful quotes, that really goes a long way. I remember at one of my interviews, I did mention that Steve Jobs quote, and it just like clicked for them. They're like, I didn't know what you were saying, but I get it now, because that quote brought everything together. Because initially I was saying, they were asking me, what do you want to do in 10 years? And I said, I have interest in this, this, and this, but I want to keep it broad because I think that one of the best ways to live life is to kind of take things as they come. And if I happen to do these things that I'm interested in, then great, but I'm open to having these interests change. And as Steve Jobs said, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking back. So even though I know this is what I kind of see myself doing, I think that at the end of the day, I'm going to be guided by my experiences at this institution. And believe it or not, of course, the reason I remember this is because I got into the school. So those quotes can really help bring things together, and they can also be integrated into stories. And as I said, stories are more memorable than rehearsed answers. So one of the reasons I love quotes, try to have 1 or 2 quotes that are meaningful to you. They don't have to be from famous people. They can even be from your grandpa or your dad or your mom. It's like my mom always said X. It's like when my dad always said X. And trust me, they'll be just as effective. And number 5 is be genuinely you. I think one of the biggest misconceptions I had going into interviews was thinking that I was never good enough and I was always trying to impress the interviewer. When in reality, the interviewers don't look at you as someone who's inferior to them. More often than not, they look at you as a very qualified applicant that got to an interview. They expect you to kind of be their equal and show them like, oh, is this someone who I want to have as my colleague at this institution? Is this someone who I can be proud that once they get out into the world, the things they accomplish are things that I'm going to be like, wow, I had a say in letting this person in. So you don't want to impress them. You want to show them that you are just a human being. And by showing them that, I think that does much bigger of a service to you, because at the end of the day, you want them to accept you for you. You don't want them to accept you for the fact that you were trying to impress them. You want them to accept you, but for the fact that you were being genuinely you. And that's one of the biggest things that changes. I think highlighting your X factor is one of the things that can be genuinely you. So, for example, for me, I used to not even mention I had a YouTube channel in a lot of my interviews. I used to not mention that I had an organic chemistry board game in many of my interviews. And the reason I eventually started mentioning it was because they became a huge part of my life and my identity. And when I mentioned it, people started showing interest in it. They're like, I can see you're really passionate about this. And even though I have no experience in organic chemistry board games or YouTube, I am really blown away by the fact that you're so passionate about it. So tell me more. And you have to be able to tell them more. And the fact that you're so passionate about it will show them, like, oh, wow, this is really different. And this guy really is interested in this. And I started talking a bit more about my YouTube and my board game in the latter half of my interviews. And that actually changed like my acceptance rate. I got accepted to most schools I interviewed at after January. But before I wasn't, I was more 50-50 because I was more often than not trying to see, like, would this even sound good? I don't know. And because of that hesitancy, my answers came across as a bit more rehearsed and not as impressive, frankly. So hopefully these 5 tips helped all of you. If they did, drop a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Peace.